Hello everyone, it's Luna. I'm back with another reading of Manga in Theory and Practice, The Craft of Creating Manga by Hirohiko Araki. And the last one was about designing characters. I have to say it was definitely my favorite chapter in the book. We shall see how this one goes, but yeah, if you get inspired by this book and if you feel like it's valuable for you, I definitely encourage you to have it in your own library. The author is great. I have to say that the way he wrote this book is really good. I don't know, I definitely love it, and it's a very good piece of information if you want to become, or if you're on a journey of becoming a mangaka. So ganbare mangakas. Chapter 4. When stories get in the way. When I describe the four major fundamentals of manga structure, I wrote, it is possible for manga to succeed based on characters or setting alone, but I can't think of a manga that stands on nothing but its story. A manga written on nothing but plot developments would probably end up like a locked room mystery, the core of which is the solving of tricks and riddles and battles of wits. The characters of note tend to be limited to the detective and the criminal, and they often feel the same as in countless other books. These types of works can have a shortcoming of motionless characters. Let me explain what I mean. In shonen manga, characters often lead a story into different directions. Take Kindaichi Shonen no Jikendo, the Kindaichi case files, which was strongly influenced by classic mystery novels. At first glance, the manga seems centered on its stories, but in reality, the main character, a high school student named Hajime Kindaichi, is the grandson of Kosuke Kindaichi, a famous fictional private detective in Japan. And the stories focus on family, legacy, and his interactions with his friends and how he investigates. The pattern is that of the story working on behalf of the characters. The opposite of that, where the characters change to suit the story, must be avoided. For example, let's say you have a protagonist, we'll call him A, who is established as being born in Shinjuku and who loves Shinjuku. If you make the story about something happening in Osaka, a city that has nothing to do with the protagonist, now you have to come up with some forced laborious explanation for why A is in that city and that he cares nothing about. If your character loves Shinjuku, the more natural setting for him to operate would be Shinjuku. In other words, the character determines the story, not the other way around. I'm not saying that no one can make a manga that centers on story and puzzles like a locked room mystery novel. I even think it would be interesting to see. But just know that by choosing to go against manga's royal road, you'd be challenging yourself to an uphill battle. Characters are vulnerable to changing times. So far, I've offered that a manga can become together without a story, and that a manga focused on story alone is not one of the royal road. Despite that, I still believe that manga needs stories. This is because manga without stories have a weakness. When a manga revolves entirely around its characters, the more the characters take the world by storm, the more dated they become in time. This happens because characters reflect the time in which they were made. The definitive character-driven manga, The Wonderful World of Sazae-san, was first written over half a century ago. If you were to read the original strips now, some parts would make little sense, and some of the meaning would be completely lost. If character-driven manga aren't updated to suit the changing times, they will find it hard to survive. If the question is how can you make a manga that will be read for a generation, the answer is story. The anime version of Sazae-san has been able to continue across the decades because new episodes are being added. They are constantly updating the show to be more modern. The episodes come together to form a continuous story that revitalizes the series. Kochikame began its first serial run in the 1970s, and one could say that the reason the manga can still support the main character, Ryo-san, is because the new episodes are still being added that update Ryo-san as a character. If you compare the Ryo-san in today's manga with the one from the beginning of the series, I think the difference in tone and feeling will be evident. Take the current wave of unsophisticated Yuru-chan character. Mascots designed to revitalize tourism and local economic development in cities across Japan. Most aren't given stories and are destined to become dated. The ones who are turning into strong characters like Kudamon and Funasi are the ones who are being given plenty of good stories and therefore story arcs across various media and events. When it comes to creating manga, the concept of episodes is incredibly important. As opposed to the overall story arc that continues throughout the serial's entire run, episodes are complete in each issue. These individual episodes play a far more crucial role than the direction of the overall story in capturing the reader's hearts and minds. Let's say a story has a defeat of a nemesis as one large overarching goal. If the process of getting there is, say, just following one long road or training really, really hard, the readers are probably going to stop reading before the story reaches its end. But if the journey is filled with episodes of various encounters and battles, the readers will be increasingly motivated to follow the story to its conclusion. The episodes are where you create situations when you think your readers will want to read, with your characters running into obstacles and going on adventures. These episodes are then connected together into the story. Even a character that decidedly come from the 1960s can still feel fresh 10 or even 100 years later, as long as a powerful story takes hold of them and pulls the reader along. The classic manga that continue to be read across generations all share this unity of character and story. This is what I call a manga's golden way. The immutable rule of story writing. Now that I've hopefully convinced you that the story is indispensable to manga, let's move on to what constitutes good stories and how to create them. Any manga that can be considered famous, as well as any novel or movies, will share a certain story beats that will never stop captivating audiences. The basic version of this structure can be summed up as Ki, Sho, Ten, Kets. I think everyone has heard about Ki, Sho, Ten, Kets. It's such a core manga structure. That's exactly what got me into reading this, actually. Let me read you what that means if you don't know. Introduction, Ki, development, Sho, twist, Ten, and resolution, Kets. Let's use a fighting manga as an example. Introduction. Introduce the protagonist to the reader. The important part here is to have the protagonist appear as quickly as possible. The reader mustn't think, what the hell is the main character going to show up? Wait, isn't the main character going to show up? Sorry, I had to reread it so I can plant that into my head. Development. The protagonist encounters the antagonist or some hardship, etc. Twist. The protagonist rises to face the challenge, but an additional problem creates a dilemma. In this part of the story, the protagonist attempts to strike back at the antagonist slash hardship, but the difficulties keep building, and the readers keep turning pages to find out what will become of the protagonist. Resolution, a victory or other happy end. For this example, I've greatly simplified the Keisho Tenketsu story structure, but this is the foundation of any shonen fighting manga, where the protagonist faces and defeats their opponents. From this one base introduction, development, twist, resolution, infinite variations can be born. There could be Keisho 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, where a hero is beset by obstacle after obstacle, or or Ketsu Ki Shoten, where the ending is revealed first. You could lead with a scene showing the fallen hero as if to give preview of what is going to occur. It could be enough to make the reader think, hey, this is something different. I wonder what happened to lead to this moment, and want to turn to the next page. Creators who willfully eschew the entire Keisho Tenketsu part pattern, for example, by making a manga that solely depicts their characters and eventful daily lives, can still produce masterworks, but only when done with purpose and knowledge of the pattern in the first place. With that exception, you must have Keisho Tenketsu in your mind when creating your story. This is the immutable rule of story writing. Internalize Keisho Tenketsu from your daily life. The Keisho Tenketsu structure is a way of thinking that you need to internalize through your daily life in order for it to become less something you have to think about and more like a kind of muscle memory. When you're making a manga, you're not going to stop at every part of the process to think this part is the introduction, this part is the development begins, and so on. If you want to become a professional mangaka, you'll observe life around you for the Keisho Tenketsu structure until it's ingrained within you. So basically, make it natural. Make it just become natural for you. I want you to become conscious of the presence of Keisho Tenketsu in not just manga, but in life and in everyday. Even a meal can provide a model example of the structure. Take a full course dinner. At Ki, the appetizer comes out. I love it how he puts it. With Sho, the meal builds into a pasta dish. With Ten, the main course provides its gravitas, and Ketsu closes the meal out with dessert. Each step comes together to tell a story. Love fits the pattern too. Two people meet, Ki, fall in love, Sho, face trials in their relationship, 10, they live happily ever after or break up, Ketsu. Sports provide good examples of the story structure in everyday life. Each match develops along the Keisho Tenketsu structure. The whistle blows near start, Ki. The opposing team appears and the game builds with uncertainty. Uncertainty. Sho. The teams present each other obstacles in cycles of attacks and defense. 10. And the victor emerges. Ketsu. If you look at it in that angle, sports manga naturally conform to the structure of their very conception. I want you to awaken the Keisho Tenketsu ever present around you. Then if you can internalize it, you won't have any trouble including the structure in your writing. The rule of rising and falling. Once you've learned the foundation of story structure, you next must be careful of the rule of rising and falling. I want you to visualize a horizontal baseline against which you will measure the rise or fall of your protagonist's emotional state or circumstances. Earlier, I touched up upon the importance of always having your characters grow, but especially in shonen manga, your protagonist must always be rising and rising, rising and rising still, building and building, or you won't have a hit. To put it in the context of a sports manga, the protagonist might start at the district level tournament, then state, then national, as he rises to meet the challenge of stronger and stronger opponents. This is a perfect example of an always rising plot. The common approach to battles in fighting manga is to always be raising the stakes and creating a question of how far it will go. If the hero does this, the enemy does that. If the hero attacks like this, the enemy counters with that. This constant build-up may feel like an inflationary bubble that is bound to burst. But if you read any successful manga, you should find that on a basic level. The protagonist is always rising. The ideal pattern is for the protagonist to overcome progressively tougher challenge as the pages turn, and for those challenges to make the reader believe the hero might lose, but the hero will always win in the end. The story's success will pivot on finding good ideas to keep this positive motion building. The protagonist always rises, whether you're working in long term or short term. When it comes to the story, the two ironclad rules are that you follow the key show tenketsu structure and that your protagonist is always rising. Even if you're changing up the structure, key show 10 10 10 10 tenketsu, through each 10 your protagonist must always be growing. I'll use Jojo's part 1 Phantom Blood as an example. At the beginning, the protagonist Jonathan is a young man with a happy life in a noble family, but his enemy, Dio, kills his dog, lays his hands. Sorry, there's visual content that I will put in here. Let me see. Where were we? Dio kills his dog, lays his hands on his girlfriend, and drives him into hardship after another. If we're looking at that graph baseline, Jonathan is on the negative side here. If you're reading that story in a graphic novel form, that section is not a very large portion of the whole. But in a weekly manga magazine, each manga only gets 19 pages an issue. That meant that Jonathan remained on the negative side for 2 or 3 weeks. That can be tough on a weekly manga, and sure enough, the readers didn't take to it, and I could feel their growing dislike of me constantly beat upon protagonist. When an installment ends with a feeling of defeat, the reader's emotions will stay down on that negative side with the protagonist, and that will be reflected in the reader's surveys. You will get the best results by ending each week with some kind of victory, if possible. But keep in mind that at the time I intended for the story to begin with Dio invading Jonathan's world and to start at that negative point from which Jonathan would rise. Though the readers spent about a month thinking this hero just loses all the time, during that was what was likely a tough read, I drew those chapters with the hope that they would stick with it for the ascent. By the way, Dio also moves in a rising direction like Jonathan. Dio accepts and embraces his evil nature and follows his dark path without hesitation. In other words, both Jonathan and Dio are living life with everything they've got, and both always maintain a rising personal arc. The violent crashes between those rising forces of good and evil form of the basis of Jojo series. And though the heroes and villains are always changing, the foundation has remained from part 1 all the way to today. The limits of a tournament structure. In order to create a scenario that constantly builds, mangaka of the 1980s 1980s turned to the tournament format. In a tournament, you have your first battle, and then the second, and then the third, and so on, each against opponents who have also risen through their victories. The readers can anticipate that this rising action will continue all the way to the peak. Famous examples include Ultimate Muscle and Dragon Ball, and it's a reliable structure that nearly guarantees success. Sorry. But the tournament format isn't perfect. Just like in an economic bubble, the problem is what happens after you've reached the top. After achieving the top victory, the next tournament starts again from the bottom. A mangaka does not want to be in the position of having to face a redo of the same story. And if the creator tries to go through with it, the result will feel incredibly forced. Just from a creative standpoint, having started from the bottom and built the story up to the top, you can't tear everything down and start over and still be able to face the toil of building it back up again when you've already felt the exhilaration of the peak. Assuming you're not planning on stopping the manga at the end of the tournament, your only option to keep going is to keep going and to have a fall after the victory and another fight to reclaim the victor's title. But that would go against the rule of always rising and won't lead to a manga of Golden Way. Why readers appreciated Stardust Crusaders. During the height of the popularity of tournament manga, I was able to approach them as a reader and enjoy the excitement, but I couldn't help but wonder, from a creator's point of view, what the mangaka would do after the top of the tournaments. At the time, Jojo was struggling in the reader service, and people even suggested that I add a tournament format to help me gain popularity. But thematically, Jojo is in part about passing the torch across generations. If Jonathan climbs to the top of some kind of tournament, what will the next generation do to have any kind of decline goes away against the royal road to shonen manga? I put some thought into how I could maintain that rising action without utilizing tournament structure. What I came up with was a journey, like the long-running television series Mito Komon, or like a board game, where each step forward is met with an enemy to fight. I used this structure for Part 3, Stardust Crusaders. At each step, an enemy is battled, but each enemy doesn't have to be stronger than the last. This avoids the tournament structure's inflationary increase in power from each fight to the next. Now, if the fighters aren't always increasing in might, then where is the positive forward motion? The protagonist and his allies are approaching a destination and they are always moving forward. In Stardust Crusaders, the protagonist Jotaro and his allies fight many opponents as they head to their final adversary, now known as Dio. Because they never turn back, the story is never moving in a negative direction. I believe that Stardust Crusader was able to elude the stagnation common to manga series, because I was able to follow the rule of always rising in a way that I didn't copy other mangaka. Weak enemies, an unorthodox method. Just as a tournament structure has its flaws, so does the journey structure have a weakness. Though each location may change, the encounters can end up becoming too similar. The challenge comes in making similar events still feel fresh. In Stardust Crusaders, I changed up the battles by not having every opponent be strong and instead use a weaker adversaries on occasion. Because there is no thrill in an easy victory. I compensated for physical weakness by making them extra devious and frightening. The idea was to make these battles offer a different challenge than just might struggling with might against might. The first of these opponents came with Ebony Devil, the stand of Devo the Cursed, whose strength and speed are sorely lacking, but those whose attacks grow more powerful as Devo's hatred intensifies. By defeating a more varied roster of enemies, Jotaro and his allies grow mentally as well as physically. Their final battle against Dio, their strongest adversary, awaits them at the end of their journey. To let the readers enjoy the suspense of each moment along the way, I only drew Dio's face in silhouette and refrained from fully revealing him until the final battle. I was worried that if I showed his face before then, readers would become too distracted by thoughts of the inevitable showdown and become less emotionally invested in the prior battles. Don't fall for the temptation to go negative. To be honest, it is truly hard work to always build in a rising direction, and you will sometimes be tempted to have your protagonist lose or face a setback, if even just once, and to move the story in a falling direction. But you mustn't give in to that temptation and break the rules of the royal road. Under the rules of rises and falls, you are allowed to start in a negative place and have the movement rise from there. But when it comes to that ever-rising direction, you can't make any compromises. The reason this is so crucial is because you want your reader's state of mind to always stay positive. If you look at it from their point of view, you'll understand that you never want to see the protagonist take a step backward. Imagine a sports manga with a protagonist who is weak, friendless, and constantly bullied. As a starting point, we're on the negative side, but if the negative continues, if he tries and tries and tries and never succeeds, would you want to keep reading something depressing? No. What people want is a positive story, where a loser triumphs over a bad situation to become a national champion. Hitting walls, a falling pattern. So then what about the pattern where the protagonist is on a positive trajectory, then hits a wall and loses, and takes a step back just once? I think this is also no good. I'm going to switch to an example from film, specifically Kick-Ass 2013, a sequel to the 2010 movie about a geeky boy who tries to become a real-life superhero. One character whom I particularly liked was a superhero called Hit Girl, but in the sequel to the popular film, Hit Girl gives up crime fighting and returns to normal life. A story like that will only irritate viewers who will think, go back to being Hit Girl. We don't want to see you not be Hit Girl. Everyone knows you're going to go back to being her at the end. As expected, she does return to her vigilante persona at the end, but all that does is bring her back to square one, and that's hardly exciting to watch. I think the creators of that movie probably wanted to show her going through normal adolescent troubles, but they should have found a way to include those elements with her still moving forward as a character. No matter how hard it may be to come up with such an idea, that work is necessary. If you end up simply at the beginning, the viewers will just think, so what? Perhaps a dip in the character's arc might have been alright if she had grown further before the end. But the movie reaffirmed my belief that a sequel has to keep moving in a positive direction if there's to be a chance of it surpassing the original. The trope of a superhero deciding to quit is my least favorite story, and it's not limited to that movie alone. For someone who is lucky enough to be a superhero, to decide to quit, in my opinion, is a fatal negative turn. When a reader sees a character like that, they will only think, What? You're not going to do anything? We all know you're going to return for the end, so just hurry up and do it already. The trap of going back to zero. Another common story is the arrival of an imposter hero, but those always end with no overall change, and are another example of the failing pattern of returning to zero. Whenever an imposter shows up, the real hero is always going to win. This isn't entertaining from the audience's perspective. It comes with the distasteful odor of a sequel coming not from a new idea but from a desire to make a follow up, just because the previous title is selling well. Ooh, we know some of those. For one Jojo video game, the developers came up with a story idea where the protagonist is captured and then escapes. At first glance, this might seem like a positive oriented arc, but it's really just going back to zero. He's captured, negative, escapes, positive, bringing him back to right where he was at the beginning, zero. In the end, I offered a different idea, and they fixed the story, to give it a positive direction. As an aside, if the hero is captured from the onset, that's a different matter. He's already captured, negative, but escapes, and finds freedom, positive, which makes it a rising story that starts at a negative point. That would be fine. Story taboos. While I'm talking about failing story patterns, this would be a good time to go over various things that mustn't be included in a story. 1. The author speaks. This is right at the top of the list of what techniques not to use. When the author inserts himself outside the panel, it's usually meant as a kind of fan service, and superfans might indeed be happy for it. But the story is what's most important, and interrupting it in this way creates a sudden rupture in the narrative. Also, any successful efforts to draw your readers into the world of your own story will go to waste, as you suddenly pull them out of it. To do this is to disrespect your readers who want to become immersed in your manga. Coincidences. Say your protagonist is in a pinch and then a meteorite suddenly falls, or a police officer happens to walk by, or an old ally shows up to save the day, or a god or gods appear, or a divine storm comes rushing in, or some other happenstance. It's not going to make for a particularly convincing resolution, is it? Now, if you've put in the work of foreshadowing it, that's one thing, but forcing something into the story that has no relation to the plot, the characters, or the setting is always a bad idea. The protagonist blunders. No matter how much trouble you're having coming up with an idea to put the protagonist into a conflict, you mustn't make the protagonist blunder into a problem of their own creation. That in itself is a negative oriented story. Let's say your protagonist is a policeman and he goes to investigate, but forgets his badge and a gun and gets into a dangerous situation because of that unusual premise. The very second the reader thinks a cop isn't going to ever do that, you've probably lost that reader. Japanese movies often use such moments, shouting, "Oh, you're right," while wildly shaking a dying person. A cell phone suddenly losing signal, going to shoot a gun only to find out it's out of ammo, outside of a gag or parody. These all exemplify a pattern that is cheap and feels cheap and are best avoided. Yeah, so when I was reading this, I was already like, that's kind of funny, like that's comedy. So I guess this is like a comedy type of things. You can just do them on purpose, of course. Or it was all a dream. This is my absolute least favorite literary device. The protagonist was the criminal all along. It's in a similar vein. These resolutions only betray the reader, who has become deeply invested in the story and has been leaving it alongside the protagonist. Was it all a dream? Is a question with only one response. Give me back the part of my life I wasted on reading this. Damn. Don't seek reality in entertainment. Obviously, reality doesn't always move in a positive direction. In life, there are setbacks, and sometimes great effort still meets with failure. Trying to capture such realism may work from an artistic standpoint, but it's not the real road to manga. Say you had a romance where the main character has troubles with their true love, so they try dating someone else. Or maybe they just idly fret about their situation. Such developments often occur in real life, but entertainment must always tell a rising story. The railroad to love stories is one of the strictly rising action. No matter the obstacles, the protagonist will overcome them and unite with their love object. Even biographies of great figures provide hope that their subject will overcome troubles and foreshadow a happy ending. Readers want to read success stories, and that means that the protagonist will continue to rise while comforting any obstacles before them. Confronting. Confronting any obstacles before them. In a Yakuza or gang story, the protagonist ascending to seize the top spot is a great story, but usually the narrative keeps on going to depict betrayal and downfall. Those, however, are downward narratives and frankly dangerous territory. The Godfather 1972 is a marvelous film as it shows Michael's rise to mafia boss, but it continues past the peak. In the sequels, Michael is beset by troubles and family betrayals in a series of realistic scenes that are brilliantly rendered. But from the point of view of the audience, they are simply unwanted and depressing. Purposefully attempting a negative arc. That said, I'm only discussing storytelling as it applies to the royal road. If a creator wishes to purposefully tell a negative arc, I think that is wonderful. The important distinction is whether the creator is attempting the challenge with awareness or in ignorance. With The Godfather Part 2, 1974, the contrasting depictions of Michael and the first Don, Vito Corleone, shows that Francis Ford Coppola had fully calculated what he was attempting. Or consider the zombie movie genre a personal favorite, which tells exclusively negative stories where death is only the outcome, but those too are calculated. One could even say they go so negative that they become positive again. I don't want to digress beyond the topic of this book, so I'll leave it at saying that zombie movies which present relentlessly declining arc are good unless they try to mix in positive elements like friendship, hope, love, and in doing so, create a pattern of ups and downs, a losing combination. Why I Killed Jonathan Joestar. If the protagonist's arc must remain positive, then it stands to reason that no matter what else happens, the protagonist must win at the end. The happy end is very foundation to the golden way. That said, depending on one's philosophy, that rule can be bent. The hero making sacrifice to save someone else is one royal road to shonen manga, and if the protagonist has to lose for that noble goal, and it comes at the end of the story, that loss could mean the protagonist's death. Offering one's own life to save another may seem on the surface a terrible negative-oriented development, but it can also be positive, happy ending. When Jonathan dies in order to save his beloved wife and child at the end of Jojo's first story arc, that is a bending of the always stay positive rule. Killing off the protagonist is about as negative as negative can be and is unthinkable in a shonen manga. But I sense that in order for the Joestar family's noble lineage to be passed down, Jonathan needed to die. I know that the readers might have been disappointed by his death, but Jonathan's blood and spirit passed on to the second protagonist, Joseph. Many stories involve a shift from one protagonist to the next, while what's important carries on. We see this in works ranging from Steinbeck's famous novel East of Eden, a tale patterned on the story of Cain and Abel, of two families in turn of the century America, to Akio Chiba's manga, Captain, where the successful captains build a nothing baseball team into champion. When stories themes include of that passing a torch, the death of replacement of a protagonist is acceptable. I might even suggest that what makes good stories, that's what makes good stories masterpieces. When I killed Jonathan in part 1, some people said, "Can you do that? What happens to the series now?" But I thought back of East of Eden and Captain and took heart. If you gamble by taking on that extreme negative, you must do so with understanding of the rule of positives and negatives, and you must be looking ahead of how you will convert it into being positive. In Jojo, Jonathan's son, Joseph, was the positive that enabled me to take that risk. Hurl your protagonist into peril. I'm often asked if I know a story from beginning to end before I start writing it. But that's not how I operate. I start with the destination the protagonist will arrive at, but before I figure out how, I first think about what characters will be in the story, and I hurl them into difficult situations. That's the point at which I start drawing. As long as you know the characters and have ideas to put them into trouble, you can make a story. Coming up with the concept can be hard, but in general, and this includes battle manga, the stronger adversary, the more interesting story becomes. Having a powerful enemy be the source of the protagonist's trouble is the best way to capture a reader's interest. The hero is completely prepared, well equipped, and trained, but the enemy is too strong or maybe politically protected or out of the protagonist's reach, and from there, the challenges stem. That kind of situation can be incredibly thrilling. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit tired here. And will make the readers unable to put the manga down. I'd like to go into a little more detailed on potential avenues for devising these challenges. You could think of a location that is a kind of place you yourself can't go, but presents a world into which you'd like to immerse the readers. For example, it could be space or a snowy mountain or a desert, and the difficulties will naturally emerge from the setting. It could be somewhere like a prison where you wouldn't want to go yourself, but you're curious to have a peek, and you can bring the readers along with you. Or you could think of the kind of situation you want to create. Maybe it's a horror suspense story, and you want to come up with a room where once entered, even opened, the next door becomes scary. In creating Jojo, I started with a predicament. For example, my protagonist will go out to stop the evildoer who's plotting world domination by brainwashing people with superhuman powers, and yeah, just a simple plot, guys. And I'm going to put the protagonist into a cross-country journey through the American West. After I come up with a challenge, I create the characters and toss them into the situation. That way, the characters can behave naturally in that setting. Let the protagonist act. To explain what I mean by hurling a character into a predicament, let me turn to an example from a one-shot called Poacher's Coast from the Thus Spoke Rohan Kishibe series. Rohan Kishibe is the protagonist and the mangaka based on myself. And in this story, he goes to harvest abalone with his friends, an Italian chef named Tonio Trussardi, only to find himself locked in an unexpected battle. Before I started this one shot, my editor suggested I do a manga that involves some kind of food. So from the start, I had planned on watching some kind of I planned on some kind of battle against some kind of food. Right at that time, I was watching a TV show called Amachan, and the episode involved bringing a paper-wrapped abalone to a shrine to give as an offering called a noshi. From that show, I learned that the shellfish are food for the gods, and I decided to go with a battle against the abalone as the premise. Now, what would happen if I were to put Rohan Kishibe into that predicament? Well, as long as I fleshed out the character with clear motives and the key Sho Tenketsu structure is in place, I can put the character in that situation and naturally follow what their behavior would be and how they would use their personality and special abilities to make it through. People often say that even if an author doesn't know where the story will go, the protagonist will act on their own. And I think this kind of approach is what that means. Just as people in real life will go about their lives with or without set plans for the next day, characters will all act as they are meant to act. If you have the settings and the characters in order, you can leave the rest to them. In Poacher's Coast, his one-shot, Rohan is confronted by large abalones. He assumes they won't be anything to worry about. They grab his legs, drag him underwater. He runs out of breath. Even more abalones latch onto him. He sinks to the seafloor and sees the skeletons of dead poachers. But he resembles something I established earlier, that octopods are natural enemies of abalones. He uses his knowledge to break free. But rather than explicitly write a story, all I did was let Rohan, the character, act. Also, in that story, Rohan is fighting to save his friend, Tonio Trussardi. As I mentioned previously, fighting for someone else is of the royal road to writing a shonen manga hero. Rohan's original motivation is nothing more than satisfying his own curiosity, but then it shifts to that of protecting his friend. When Rohan becomes determined to save his friend's life, even a great risk to his own, he becomes an active character in The Poacher's Coast, a more appealing story. The hardest part comes not at the beginning, but just before the end. However, if you allow a character's actions to dictate an entire story without having thought of how the end will be settled, continuing all the way through without aim, the ending will likely be a letdown. Your manga's ending will determine whether the reader closes the book with satisfaction or in disappointment. You mustn't simply phone it in. The point that's crucial here comes just before the conclusion, the key Sho Tenketsu structure. Even more than the conclusion, this is the story's biggest moment. If you can face your protagonist with a dilemma that will excite your readers and make them think, how are they going to get through this? You will have a story that will grip those readers and never let go. In my case, I prepare that final challenge before it comes. But I don't go into it knowing how the protagonist will overcome it. Not even after I started. I faced that crisis alongside my protagonist, and I tried to think what I would do myself in that situation. As I let my characters act, the ideas begin to come to me. In Jojo's fourth act, for example, as I was drawing that last battle between Josuke and Yoshikage Kira, I put Josuke in such a bad place that even I thought he might not be able to win. Like Josuke, I couldn't see a way out for him, and for a time I was worried that I'd gotten myself into a bad spot. But I knew that I was doing exactly what I needed to do. I had to put myself into that character and be with him in that terrible struggle. And when he finally found a way through that impossible scenario, I was as elated as if I had actually gone through that experience myself. Learn storytelling from Hemingway. Your story will be created by your character's action, but it's important that they not try to explain the story. Say I were to start a Rohan Kishibe one-shot with Rohan expounding, I am a mangaka and I'm thinking about going out to find material for a new story. There's something that's really caught my interest, and it is dot dot dot. Not only that would be clunky, but it's not something I want to do. I believe that the story must be really revealed or organically through your character's action, natural conversation, mannerism, locations, and so on. A perfect example of this show, don't tell approach can be found in Ernest Hemingway's short story The Killers. The story begins with a scene where two men enter a lunchroom and order their meals. The kind of men they are is revealed not through direct descriptions, but through the things two men say. I'll pull an excerpt from the beginning to illustrate. I'll have a roast pork tenderloin with apple sauce and mashed potatoes, the first man said. It isn't ready yet. Sorry for my impression. I just had to. What the hell do you put it on the card? What the hell do you put it on the card for? That's the dinner, George explained. You can get that at 6 o'clock. George looked at the clock on the wall behind the counter. It's 5 o'clock. The clock says 20 minutes past 5, the second man said. It's 20 minutes fast. Oh, to tell the clock. To hell with the clock, sorry, the first man said. What have you got to eat? I can give you any kind of sandwiches, George said. You can have ham and eggs, bacon and eggs, liver and bacon, or a steak. Give me chicken croquettes with green peas and cream sauce and mashed potatoes. That's the dinner. Everything we want's the dinner, eh? That's the way you work it. That was the scene from Hemingway's The Killers. Without writing, the two men have killed before, or they have guns, or they are hired killers, or anything of that sort. The back and forth dialogue creates a vivid image that these two are not average men and are some sort of criminals. The short story continues, almost entirely using dialogue to paint the scenes, and that's all it needs to flesh out the characters and setting of the story. The story is a good example of showing how to write, and its strong influence can be felt in the tough back and forth dialogue of hard-boiled detective fiction in Quentin Tarantino's movies and beyond. The dialogue is best when natural. When writing dialogue, the basic aim is to keep it feeling natural. As your characters go about their actions, don't overthink the dialogue. Just write what they would naturally say in each situation. Later you can go back over the lines and make sure they are understandable. Say a pretty girl suddenly appears before your protagonist. Does he get nervous? Does he flirt? Does he tease her? Does he approach her respectfully and with good manners? From slight differences in his mannerism and between the lines of his speech, the character's nature will be revealed. Also, dialogue in a manga is never made more cool by using obscure or foreign words. In my opinion, it's best not to overthink the dialogue or add in dressed up words in an attempt to elevate the scripts. Ultimately, the best approach to communicating your story is to write characters with a way of thinking that's relevant to your own life and to write dialogue that is easily understood and similar to daily speech. This will allow your story to reveal itself and help you express the world of your creation. If I suddenly walked into a desk, I'd probably say something like, "Fucking hell, where the hell is the desk doing here?" Those are the kind of lines that would come natural to me if I were in that situation. I wouldn't say, "I hope I didn't hurt that desk," or "Wow, that was something else." I'm often told that the dialogue in my manga is distinctive, but I'm only writing lines based on the way I actually think and talk in my daily life. Characters vastly different from yourself are an exception to this rule and will likely require research. Your characters are an important part of establishing the setting. Their professions may have jargon, such as with sushi chefs, or there may be certain words someone like your character would never say. In the case of historical fiction, you may or may not want to reproduce the language of the time, but if you throw in a few words from that period, you can better convey the sense of being in that time. Insert flavor in ways only manga can. One more thing on dialogue, because manga has the ability to draw readers into a fantasy world with the turn of a page. Dialogue calls for more than being natural, but also to have feeling that only manga can include. Let's say there was, as in common in Japan, a truck with a loudspeaker advertising an electronics recycling service as it drove down the street. And its message was more unctuous than polite. You might write something like, "May I have your attention, please? If you have any unneeded appliances or computers, don't hesitate to consult with us." But in this case, words alone won't convey the intended nuance. If you're in a situation where that kind of nuance is required to express your characters, you can use other elements of manga to convey emotions or tone of voice. It's also important to use beautiful and correct language, but when it comes to expressing a manga's world and characters, a mangaka shouldn't rule out of straying from what's in the dictionary. By using more vernacular speech, you can make your characters more distinctive. How to make a suspenseful story. Jojo's third story arc. I'll close this section with an explanation of how I created the story for chapter 7 of Jojo's third story arc, Stardust Crusaders. This chapter plays the important role of developing the motive of the protagonist Jotaro for setting out to fight Dio. The chapter begins with Jotaro and his father Joseph, unable to find his mother Holly at home. In the still and quiet house, Avol, Joseph's friend from Avdol, my apologies. Avdol, Joseph's friends from Egypt finds a spoon on the hallway floor. I could have then cut directly to Avdol finding Holly collapsed in the kitchen, but that would be too direct and lacking any feeling of surprise or drama. The scene would fall flat. Instead, I begin with the panel of the spoon lying in the hallway. Then, as Avdol moves into the kitchen, I present the suspenseful angles of bowls and pans strewn about the kitchen floor. This gives reader a sense of unease as they question why everything is on the floor. Only then did I continue on to reveal wholly unconscious. The intent was to heighten suspense and build the realization that Holly had suddenly collapsed while doing housework. I like to use this method of suspense, pursuing a mystery in the very definition of suspense, and the pursuit of the unknown brings out instinctual feelings of unease, curiosity, and fear. That's why people are drawn in by suspenseful techniques. I feel that suspense can be applied to any genre, including sci fi, horror, drama, and more, and serves as the foundation of entertainment that appeals to human nature. My goal with this chapter was to show Jotaro's motivation, but at the end, I also added a 2-page spread featuring the characters represented as tarot cards. When I designed the 4 main characters Jotaro, Joseph, Mohammed Avdol, and Noriaki Kakyoin, I made sure they would be recognizably distinct from their silhouettes alone. I also gave Avdol a more ethnic feel, not only to provide a contrast with Jotaro, but to foreshadow the journey leading to his home country of Egypt. This image conveys the idea that a group of people are joining a shared fight, much like in the movie The Seventh Samurai, 1954. And in doing so, informs the reader that this manga will be headed in that direction. The design also incorporates the idea that the 4 are connected by something akin to destiny and signals those connections as a primary theme for Jojo's 3rd arc. And then they show these panels that you can find in the manga if you read the manga. Same as me though. There was a major spoiler in the manga, but we're done with the chapter now, guys. I hope this was okay reading. Really sorry that I've been like just stumbling upon on words and stuff. It's been a long chapter. The recording is already 1 hour. So many apologies on me stumbling upon words, or if I didn't make it too clear. I will try to remember the parts where I didn't make it clear so I can complete with some visual. If like, you can just tap into the video and see the dialogue by example and stuff like that. So yeah, we're done with chapter 4. It was pretty good. I'm really happy with reading this book. I hope you guys are well and are interested in reading more of this book with me. So I'm gonna go now. I will see you in the next chapter.